Well, first of all, I just want to thank Tom. One of the things that Tom and I get to do from time to time is that, we travel the world, do what we do, observe the world from very different vantage points, and we get together occasionally to kind of compare notes to see what we're seeing. We will argue, we'll debate. And in fact, so Jane actually said, why don't you guys come do it here? And we said, okay. In fact, the last time we did this, I don't know if you remember, Tom, was actually at the council in 2015. We had a similar conversation when we were comparing notes. At the time, I think, Tom, you were putting the finishing touches to your last book, which is Thank You for Being Late. And this was a few years after you'd just done The World is Flat, where you'd chronicled a whole range of phenomena that was going on. So anyway, so we're going to have a conversation. We're going to compare notes again. And as Tom and I always do, we typically kind of list a bunch of areas we want to get to. I don't know if we'll follow that because we kind of never do. We end up touching lots of different topics. But I'll try and make sure we get to a few key topics we want to get to. But I thought we would start where we left off. At the time, Tom, you were starting to describe how technology was changing everything. Let's start there. What's happened in the last? How have your own thoughts about technology changed and evolved over the last few years? Where are we?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you, James. Last time we did this was in a garage. We filmed in somewhere in Washington, D.C. at an undisclosed location. And Jane, thank you and congratulations. What a great World Affairs Council you built. So my last book, Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Acceleration, was built on the argument that the world isn't just changing today, it's actually being reshaped. That's a very different thing. And it's being reshaped because we're in the middle of three nonlinear accelerations all at the same time with the three largest forces on the planet, which I call the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. So the market is globalization, but not your grandfather's globalization. That was containers on ships and planes. It's actually digital globalization, where everything's been digitized and globalized through Facebook, PayPal, MOOCs, et cetera, something that McKinsey Global Institute has done great research on. Moore's Law, of course, is the speed and power of microchips will double every 24 months. That's still alive and well. And of course, Mother Nature is climate change, biodiversity loss, and population growth in the developing world. All three look like giant hockey sticks when you put them on a graph. And I believe you cannot understand what's going on in the world today unless actually you're looking at the interaction between all three. So one of my teachers, Lynn Wells, likes to say, never think in the box today, never think out of the box. Today you must think without a box. And I think thinking without a box means arbitraging these three technologies. So one of the things that I've been following since then, James, or almost sort of looking back at the span of my work over the last 20 years, is that we know technology moves up in steps, and you get a breakthrough of technologies, they diffuse and they beget the next step. They diffuse, they beget the next step. So around 2000, a set of technologies came together and each step is biased toward a certain set of capabilities. So around 2000, a set of technologies came together that were biased toward connectivity. And that was actually driven by the collapse in the cost of fiber optic cable, thanks to the dot-com boom, bubble, and bust. Sorry, Mom, didn't mean to, but I shrunk the world, all right? And we discovered that when we woke up in the year 2000 and realized we needed to remediate all these computers for the Y2K problem. Right. Those of you who remember that. And we needed tens of thousands of engineers, and we actually discovered we could leverage 180,000 Indian engineers to remediate these computers because the world had gotten so interconnected. Connectivity became fast, free, easy, virtually free, easy for you, and ubiquitous.
Right. And what was remarkable about that, though, just to expand on that a little bit, was that we really did connect everybody.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just the developed world. It was, as you pointed out, India, but also places in Africa, places in Latin America, places in Asia. In fact, one of the things that's quite fascinating is if you look at the volume of cross-border data flows, they just took off in terms of the data flows that were happening between continents, between countries, developed and developing. We really did wire everybody.
And right? I came along and gave that moment a name. I said it felt like the world is flat. it felt like I can touch people for just the reasons you said, James, who I could never touch before, and I could be touched by people who could never touch me before. I called my mom at one point during that period, and she was clearly distracted, and I said, "Mom, what's wrong?" She said, "You're interrupting me. I'm playing bridge with someone on the internet in Siberia." And so suddenly she was touching and being touched by people who could never. Now that platform begat the next platform, and that happened around 2007, when a suite of technologies came together, beginning with the iPhone, Facebook, Twitter, Hadoop, GitHub, the Kindle, Watson, big data, the cloud. All of these actually happened in a single year, and I tell that story in my book, The Year of 2007. And that new platform was biased toward complexity. That suddenly we made complexity fast, free, easy for you, and invisible. Suddenly, with one touch, I could page a taxi, direct a taxi, pay a taxi, rate a taxi, tip a taxi, and be rated by a taxi. And we abstracted all that complexity into one touch. And what it did was it put, my friend Craig Mundy, who was CTO of Microsoft, said, it put grease into everything, James. Suddenly, we could move huge forces with so little energy. Right. So the world kind of went from flat to fast.
Right, but even as it got fast, though, you started to see something else happen, which is interesting, which is the way businesses took advantage of those capabilities. Mm-hmm. And what was striking about that is all of a sudden, you were not just doing things efficiently. You're starting to get insights. You're starting to do things that you couldn't have done before. But the thing that was actually quite striking, Tom, it is from our work, was to see how uneven that was. So if you looked at, for example, companies, for example, or sectors in the economy, and you try to measure, for example, how digitized are they, companies or sectors or even countries for that matter, you'd see an unevenness. So at the time, I remember we actually looked at, for example, how digitized was the US economy. And the conclusion was if you compared the most digitized companies and also the most digitized sectors of the economy, like the tech industry and so forth, and compare them to the rest, we were only kind of 18% of the way there. And there's this huge unevenness, which also started to lead to the performance differentials you started to see between companies and between sectors. Some were way ahead in using these technologies, and others were way behind. And even in the retail sector, you could find that the most digitized companies, Amazon and others, were way ahead, but there's a long tail of other entities and other companies were not as digitized. So you started to see differences in performance.
And that really then begat, I would say one thing about that step, and where I first got the insight of complexity being free, when I'm really depressed, I do things like go to the research lab of a great American company, or a once great American company, in this case GE, in Niskayuna, New York.
Right.
And because you see they're just the UN of brains and talent from around the world. They're remarkable places, the research labs of these cutting edge companies. So I went up to Niskayuna, it's probably around 2013, 2014, and they were showing me their 3D printing lab. This was still early in the 3D printing process, and the stuff they were printing was just amazing. And at one point, the woman, who was from Romania, she was a GE scientist from Romania, was giving me a tour, and she said, and I was expressing amazement at what I was seeing, and she said, "Mr. Friedman, you have to understand, complexity is now free." And I said, "Wait a minute, did you just say that like right now? Or is that like written above the lab? Complexity is free." And so that's where it first entered my mind. Well, I think that step has now begat a new step. Basically we're going from who you can touch and who can touch you, to what you can do with one touch, to what you can now do or what happens with no touch. Where a friend of mine, P.V. Kannan, who runs a AI company that does customer relations from India, has written a book called The Age of Intent. And basically, his company answers the phone for companies around the world now. And they measure every day how deep in the conversation you can go with their AI bot, and how soon it can detect your intent. Just like you notice you type on Google now your Gmail and it starts to finish your sentence.
Right.
So we're going what I call from flat to fast to deep, basically. Now you're getting deep insights, deep knowledge, deep detection of intent, deep surveillance, deep fake. Everything is going deep. And I believe the word of the year of 2019 is going to be deep. If you notice how many things we're describing with the adjective deep. And of course, the song that won the Oscars this year by Lady Gaga was called Shallow. But if you actually listen to the words are, we've left the shallow now. We're off on the deep end. Watch as I dive in. And so I think that was kind of in the zeitgeist. Right. And I think the kind of political, technological challenge we have right now is the asymmetry by which we've gone deep. These technologies have gone deep into whether it's in cyber war, in learning, in being able to detect your intent. They've gone far deeper, faster than we've been able to develop the norms, regulations, and governance to basically govern them.
Yeah, and in fact, let's spend a little bit of time on that, because I'd love to get your take. You and I haven't quite compared notes on this yet, which is, it's just been fascinating what's happened with AI specifically, right? The development of artificial intelligence. And in fact, 20 years ago, I did my PhD in AI, and we never imagined
you were ahead of your time.
We would actually we'd see the kind of results and performance that we're seeing now. And quite frankly, the results have largely been a function of, the algorithms got a little bit better, but we have lots more data and compute. Right, that we throw at the problem, and that's how we made this enormous progress. And I think one of the complicating things about AI is that on the one hand, you can say clearly good for business because you can, understand intent and understand, and be able to use that in ways that are useful, drive productivity, prediction, and all kinds of things. So, arguably good, good for business. You could also say it's good for the economy, because one of the things that automation technologies and AI technologies can do is contribute to productivity growth, which is critical for economic growth.
Right.
So you could say good for business, good for the economy.
And would you say we're finally starting to see that productivity uptick?
Slowly. So in the places where you've seen the application of these technologies, you are seeing that.
Interesting.
Now, the problem is it's not as widespread as you would expect. So there's still more to come, hopefully. In fact, one of the key questions, obviously, that economists are grappling with is, why aren't we seeing the productivity gains that were promised?
Yes.
Right. And I think there's a little bit of observations and arguments about time lags and also
measurement.
Measurement is a big thing, right? Because we now have technologies that, quite frankly, we don't measure at all.
Right.
All the stuff that's free typically doesn't show up in our GDP or measurement statistics. But I think you could safely say these technologies, AI in particular, and automation, is good for the economy and good for business. I think where it gets complicated is in a couple places. One is when we think about the impact on work and how that's going to impact the workforce. And I'm sure that we'll get to, because one of the things you and I know when I talk about is what's happening with work and inequality and so forth. But I think on the work question, most of the really kind of careful research that's been done largely concludes now that if you look at the next decade or two, we shouldn't worry about a jobless future, because between the jobs that are going to decline and the ones that will grow, I think we come out okay. But what we should worry about, though, is how we manage those transitions. So we know that, for example, there's going to be big occupational shifts as people shift from the declining occupations and the ones that grow. We also know that there's going to be massive skill shifts. When people work alongside machines, they move from... So the skill shift and the occupational shifts are very significant. And then the other big important shift is one I'm sure we'll come back to, is this question about impact on wages and incomes.
Well, let's start there, James.
And that's complicated. That one's complicated.
Because it's a good segue to the current political debate. That certainly for Democrats, a big part of what you need to have a voice on or a position on in this election is inclusive growth and the whole question of wage gaps. Explain to me something. We have a soaring stock market. We have de minimis unemployment, record low unemployment, but wages just beginning to creep up but certainly not soaring. Square that circle for me.
Well, this is actually one of the most vexing questions, right? Because if you had looked at the economy 20, 30 years ago, any previous period, if we'd had the kind of low unemployment we've got, wages would be rising quite significantly. But they've barely moved, especially when you look at it through the lens of households.
Right.
So one of the big questions, by the way, that's actually interesting is why is it that wages have stagnated and are in fact declining? We know that one of the reasons for that is, just to get wonky a little bit here, is what's called the declining labor share. So if you look at the national income, which is typically measured as GDP, the portion of that, even before we debate how it's distributed, the portion of that goes towards wages and labor has been declining slowly over time. And there's good reason, but by the way, there's...
Because the guy or gal who bought the machines is capturing a larger portion of it as opposed to the worker.
That's true. So the way to think about that, Tom, is if you had built a factory 100 years ago, almost all your inputs into that factory would have been labor inputs, right? That's what
labor
you
and
did.
raw materials, yeah.
Labor and raw materials. That'd be almost all of it. Now, over time, because of technological advancements, you have labor, but you also buy equipment. Some of those are robots, some of those are machinery. So that mix has been changing, and that change is actually kind of accelerated a little bit in the last 20 years. So that's one of the reasons why then the portion that's available for labor, even before it gets distributed, is actually a little bit less. That's one of the reasons. The other big reasons is because, a long time ago, it used to be that economists would tell you that if you grow the economy and if you grow productivity, wages will go up.
Yeah.
That was actually very true. If you draw the lines over the 100 years, you'd see that pattern. But we know that in the last few years, in the last couple of decades, when productivity goes up, it doesn't quite lift wages quite as much as it used to. So there's a bunch of these reasons that...
Because?
Well, part of that is because of this labor capital mix shift that's occurred. Some of that has to do with the way people work with machines and technology. And quite often you end up with this, one of the challenges is when you have the machines do the value-added portion of the work, and you have people do the less complex work, then the wages for that don't go up as much.
Interesting.
And it's tied to the skill base of the workforce. That's why these questions about skills and education really matter a lot.
Yes.
So if we think we've had a challenge with skills and education, they could actually get worse before they come better. So this comes back to this question, and we've seen, and taking it back to the politics, one of the striking observations, Tom, is that if you look at most of the advanced economies and you ask the question, where have we seen the stagnation of wages the most? It's been the US, the UK, France, Italy, Austria. See where this is going, right? Yep. So you start to get a feel for where this isn't quite working for the workforce. And that's actually one of the things we're going to need to figure out a way to solve. Then you add inequality to that.
Which is why if I were advising someone running for president, high on my agenda would be that you have a position on, I think one of the most productive things we can do is pass a law that would radically incentivize companies to go back into the education business, to be constantly training their workers. And I think the best companies are doing that in part because in a tight labor market, it's actually cheaper to retrain a worker than go out and hire one. And you're already seeing now companies like AT&T and others really get back into the education business. A new model, Brandon Bastide, who used to run polling on education for Gallup, just sent me, he's now with Kaplan, sent me a study he's done, which is arguing that we're headed for a whole new model where young people will graduate from high school, go immediately to work for a company, and then spend half their time learning and half their time working. That in the old days where you worked in order to learn, in order to work, now it's going to be work, learn, work, learn, work, learn, work, learn, and it'll be a constant process.
But I think those investments on learning and on-the-job skilling and learning, I think the responsibility, the incentives we need to create are for both companies, as you pointed out, but also even the commons and the public investments we make in that. One of the interesting observations is that if you look at countries like the United States, the amount that we spend in publicly and also in the private sector on-the-job worker training has been declining for the last 20 years. It's actually, you can actually draw the picture, it's actually been declining. In fact, it's actually one of the lowest in the OECD countries. So we're headed the wrong way at a time when, in fact, it should be going up. But I want to come back to you, though, on a question. I mean, the wage question is clearly, and the income is clearly a big question. What do you think about the inequality debate we're having, just from because...
Well, I think what's interesting about the inequality debate, this is a point my friend Marina Gorbis from the Institute of the Future was making to me just the other day, is that we don't just have a wage gap. We have a wealth gap. There's a difference just between wages and the actual wealth that people can accumulate, because wealth also comes in many forms. A great public park is wealth. A great public transportation system is wealth. A great public school system is wealth. And we've been, for people who may not have the wages, but if you live in a country, let's take an extreme like Denmark, that has a great commons, their wages may not be there, but their wealth is not as deficient as you find in a country where wages are stagnant. And so there's less investment not only in individuals, because we've incentivized companies to write off their R&D, to depreciate their equipment, but not to depreciate not to have a tax advantage to educate workers. And all of that is misaligned. And it relates, James, to a larger point, which is that what's new about this moment in history is that in the old days, if you're running for election, you were for, everything was like very simple and binary. I'm for cutting taxes, I'm for raising taxes. Today, I believe one of the difficulties of leadership and governance, for all the reasons you just described, is that you actually have to get 100 things right, not just one, and the list changes every year.
Well, let me make it even worse, right? I think one of the other things that's changed, if you look at economies, the U.S. economy, say 50 years ago versus now, is that what matters to the individual depends on what aspect of the individual you're talking about. So let's go through it, right? So what's an individual today in the economy, right? They are a worker, they're a consumer, right? They are a saver or an investor, they are a citizen, they are a person who lives on planet Earth who cares about the environment and so forth. If you look at all those aspects of the person, the economy works better or worse for some of those. I think for the most part, if you're a consumer, this has actually been great for the most part. Because if you look at the prices of most things, price of computers, cell phones, I mean, the consumer has benefited a lot from globalization, technology, as a consumer of these things. Look at all the things we can do with technology now. They're amazing, right? But if you look at that question from the point of view of the worker, it's a different story. I mean, globalization is a perfect example of this. One of the things I think the mistakes that we've all made, as economists looking at these things is often when we talk about the benefits of globalization, very often we talk about the consumer. We're not talking, we talk about choice, we talk about free product, we're not talking about the worker. Then you get to the questions about the saver. You just pointed out this wealth question. One of the things that was striking me, one of my colleagues, Monique, who's in here somewhere, was just telling me today that if you looked last year, something like 20-something% of American households didn't save anything. They couldn't afford to. They couldn't afford to as savers.
They're one car accident away from bankruptcy.
They couldn't save anything. If you looked at the bottom 10% of households in America in 1999, they were in debt about $20,000. Guess what it is today? It's about $69,000, right? And many of them, so it's not just the degree of indebtedness, it's also who it is, right? So unlike 20, 30 years ago, the people who are indebted actually now are often younger and actually educated.
Wow.
Right? So so as a saver in an economy, we now have a problem. If you're talking about this as a citizen, then you get into all kinds of complications, right? You start, as a citizen, you worry about things like privacy, security, U.S. competitiveness, national security, which are often at odds than if you're thinking about it as a global consumer,
right?
Because you want everything from everywhere, right? So I think these questions have become more complicated in that sense. Back to your point about you can't just have a single slogan; you have to get 100 things right.
And that's why I think, you can step back and say, why have political parties all over the world all over the industrial world have blown up in the last 2 years? The British Tory party has completely blown up. The Labor Party there is now a Marxist party. It's blown up. The Republican Party is completely blown up. It used to be for deficit reduction and free trade, and it's now a Trumpian party. The Democrats will blow up as soon as they're in power. You can already see that happening. France is ruled by a president who represents no party that ever existed before. In fact, France is the only country in the world, and my friend Michael Mandelbaum pointed us out to me the other day, that has a leader with no followers and an opposition with no leader. Italy is governed by two parties that one's far right and one's far left. So they've actually all blown up. So why is that, James? I think part of the reason is for so many years, in a slower, less connected world, all these parties were basically playing off the same set of binary choices. Capital versus labor, big government, high regulation, small government, low regulation, open to trade, closed to trade, open to immigration, closed to immigration, social norms to be banned, gay marriage, transgender rights, social norms to be embraced, and green versus growth. And the parties just lined up along those five binary choices, election after election. So what I say to people today is imagine that I'm a steel worker in Pittsburgh. And Monday to Friday, I belong to the steel union. I'm with labor, baby. Solidarity, labor. But on Saturday, I drive for Uber. And on Sunday, to pick up a little spare change, I rent out my daughter's bedroom on Airbnb. And then in the afternoon, I go shopping at Walmart for the cheapest made Chinese goods, and what I can't find there, I buy from a chatbot on Amazon.com. Saturday and Sunday, baby, I am with capital. I am with capital. Which party am I in?
Right.
It's, that's why they're all blowing up, because people sometimes say to me, Friedman, this is meant as an insult, you're a centrist. And I say, actually, I'm not, calling me a centrist implies I'm mush between the right and the left. I can't make up my mind. Actually, I'm not even on your grid anymore, because I think the grid is completely different.
Well, speaking of grids, and I like your steelworker example, one of the other inequalities we haven't talked about, and I'm just curious because you travel around to so many places. One of the things that seems to be another inequality we don't talk about as much is call it the inequality of place.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the, in my role, we tend to look at these, big picture questions, looking at the U.S. as an economy.
Yeah.
But when you look underneath that and you go from place to place, county to county, the picture is very different. Right?
So the cliche about America, James, is we're a country divided between two coasts that are liberalizing, pluralizing, diversifying, globalizing, and modernizing, a place like San Francisco. And then there's flyover America, where everyone's high on opioids, voted for Trump, and waiting for 1950 to come back. That's kind of the cliche. Well, I happen to be from flyover America. I grew up in a small community outside of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park, which I wrote about in my last book. And all you have to do is be from flyover America to know that ain't true. In fact, if you want a job, I come to Minneapolis, So the country is in fact a checkerboard of communities that are rising from the bottom up and communities that are collapsing from the bottom down. And I think the most interesting political science question that I'm wrestling with today is, why does one community rise and one fall, and some are right next door to each other?
Why is that?
Well, I think that...
Well, give us the characteristics of the ones that are rising.
Right.
What do they look like?
Right.
And then the ones that are...
So I just happen to I've been doing these forays to different communities. So last June I went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I wrote a 5,000-word column about Lancaster because it was a dying community in the 1990s, a town in eastern Pennsylvania, and 600,000 people. It's Amish Mennonite country. And last year was named by Forbes magazine one of the 10 coolest cities in America. And I told the story about how Lancaster turned itself around. Meanwhile, York, Reading, and Harrisburg are falling off the map.
Right.
Okay. So last week, I did one I've wanted to do for a long time. I had so much fun. I went to a town called Wilmer, Minnesota. So, because I'm from Minnesota, and I've always wanted to know what was going on in Wilmer, because in 1949, my aunt and uncle, my dad's sister and brother-in-law, after the war, moved to this town in central Minnesota, west central Minnesota, and called Wilmer, then about 15,000 people, and they opened up a little steel company, a distribution company. And there were two other Jewish families in the town, probably two other Jewish families in all of west central Minnesota. anyways, they thrived there. But I never forgot, James, it was probably 40 years ago. My aunt came down to Minneapolis once for a holiday, and I visited Wilmer every year for 50 years. And about 40 years ago, she came down and she said to me, everybody sitting down? She said, Tom, I was in the grocery store and I heard someone speaking Spanish. Never forgot that. It could have been Martian, you know what I mean? It was like, so last Monday, a week ago today, I went to Wilmer. Right. Hadn't been there in about 10 years. And our first stop was Wilmer High School. And we came into the high school, we were greeted by the principal, and he showed me a giant steel map on the wall, about the size of this blue poster, of the world. And he explained that they take it down at the beginning of every year, and the kids put pins in all the different countries they're from. And today, Wilmer High School is a quarter Somali and Latino. And the map was made by the successor steel company of my aunt's steel company.
Oh, wow. That's a cool story.
So the story of Wilmer is the story of small town Minnesota, which is that Wilmer has 2.2% unemployment. If you can fog up a mirror, you can get a job in Wilmer, okay? And by the way, not just at the Genio turkey processing plant, but as a bioscientist or what, they need everything, okay? Huge labor demand. And what you see in Wilmer and what you saw in Lancaster, which is the common denominator of the towns that are rising, are two things. One is that they all have created complex adaptive coalitions where business partners with the philanthropic community, partners with the education community, partners with the social entrepreneurship community, partners with local government to build a coalition to manage the change at a time when national governments are too paralyzed by tribal politics, so they're frozen. They can't deal with these giant accelerations, and the single family is too weak. The town is now, the community is the right governing unit for the 21st century. They have enough trust to come together, and they're all catalyzed by this political category called leaders without authority. These are not traditional leaders. They're people in the community say, not going to happen in my town on my watch. Not going to happen in Lancaster. Not going to happen in Wilmer. And the other thing they have in common is that they've made the transition to inclusion. Right. Wilmer had a moment there. First Ramadan, when they had a large concentration of Somalis, they wanted to use the town's community center as their mosque. Some people said, no way, no way. And the mayor, who's a former fire chief, one of his classic guys, said, no, there is a way. That is going to be their mosque for Ramadan. And they made the transition. So you're in a labor market where you have 2.2% unemployment, and the only influx of labor in your state are Somalis. If you cannot manage inclusion, if you cannot learn that Somalis actually don't eat lutefisk, on Ramadan, and that they actually have a different diet, and how to relate to that, you're going to be a dying town. And the towns that are dying are all those who could not manage inclusion, which is a very interesting backdrop to the immigration debate that we're having, because that's actually what's going on in the country. Right. And that really accounts for which communities are rising and which ones falling.
Well, if I take that example, though, Tom, and it's a wonderful kind of example of the kind of inclusive, interdependent, community-based, power you can actually unleash. But you started at the point that it has 2.2% unemployment, right? And the reason I point that out is because, when you look at so we've done this work. We've looked literally county by county across the United States. And there's a set of about 180 counties that you could describe as distressed Americana, for example. Roughly close to 20 million people live there. If you look at those communities, first of all, they haven't had, infusion of capital or investment for a few decades. Yeah. The capital's moved out. If you look at the education systems, the attainment rates and dropout rates are extraordinarily high. Yeah. And you look at, so for example, in this set of 180 counties, I think, for example, the percentage of people who live there who have bachelor's degrees, I think it's about 12%. Versus, say, if you take a county, I don't know what it's like in Minnesota, in the community you're talking about, but take Seattle or San Francisco, where people with bachelor's degrees is like close to 50%, right? So you have these fundamental, difficult challenges in some places. And so the question is, how do we tackle that when you've got some communities that have figured it out, but also have some initial good starting points of investment, capital, education systems that work and all of that, versus places that don't?
Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge. And in some cases, I've done a lot of work in Nashville, actually. Right. And what happened in Nashville is they built a complex adaptive coalition. And they were now busing in workers from 2 hours away.
That's cool. Right.
So I think the successful communities, in some cases, are going to eat the unsuccessful or will absorb the unsuccessful ones. In other cases, there'll be emulation. I mean, the biggest speaking requests I get today are to speak to these communities. You know, because this is the most interesting thing happening in the country right now. You never know it following our politics. You know, again, which is why if I were advising a candidate, I mean, if I were running, I'd be running as a progressive localist. How do I push more and more authority down to the highest trust level? Because government moves at the speed of trust. Right. And you've got to move really fast and be very nimble and adaptive. Right. You know, James, one of the things we've talked about before is another way to describe the technological moment we're in, I believe, is through the prism of climate change. Right. So I actually believe we're in the middle of 3 climate changes at once. We're in the middle of change of the climate. We're going from what I call later to now. So when I was growing up in Minnesota, later was when I could clean that river, purify that lake, rescue that orangutan. I could do it now, I could do it later, okay? Today, later is officially over. Later will now be too late. So whatever you're going to save, please save it now, because later is over. Right. That's a climate change. Right. Second, we're going through a change in the climate of globalization. Right. We're going from an interconnected world to an interdependent world. Well, that's a very different world. Because in an interdependent world, you get a geoeconomic inversion where your friends start to be able to kill you faster than your enemies. Right. So if Greek and Italian banks had gone under last night, this meeting might have been canceled. Wait a minute, Greece, Italy, they're in NATO. Right. They're in the EU. They're allies. Right. They can kill us in an interdependent world. And in an interdependent world, your rival falling becomes more dangerous than your rival rising. And we saw that this morning when you checked your portfolio. Because if China took 6 more islands in the South China Sea last night, don't tell anybody, couldn't care less. Had China lost 6% growth last night, this meeting, this was canceled, this is gone. Jane's calling all over, basically. Right. Gone. This meeting's over. So China falling in an interdependent world, much more dangerous than China rising. And lastly, and I learned this from you, every company is going through a climate change. Because, you know, I wrote in The World is Flat, whatever can be done will be done. The only question is, will it be done by you or to you? By a competitor or a bad guy, because they're both early adopters. Right. So I'm always looking at what can be done. And that's why as a foreign affairs columnist, I spend so much time at companies. Because I want to know what can be done, because that tells me what's going on at the tip of the spear. So what can be done today is every company can and therefore must sensorize, capture all the data around its business, then analyze that data using big data to find the needle in the haystack of its data as the norm, not the exception. Right. Then optimize off that data all its processes, prophesize off that data. You've seen the ad for the IBM Watson repairman. He shows up at a high-rise building, tells the doorman, I'm here to fix the elevator. The doorman says the elevator's not broken. And he says, I know, but it will be in 6 weeks and 3 days. Okay, right. So I can prophesize off my data. I can customize off my data just for guys from Minnesota with brown eyes and a mustache. I can localize off that data just for Stutter Street. I can socialize off that data. And I can leverage social networks to connect with employees, customers, and suppliers as never before. And I can automatize and digitize off that data. You put all those together, as you guys have described so well, every company's got to go through this climate change, and not many have. So if you think about it, we're in the middle of 3 climate changes at once. And what I thought about was, well, what do you want when the climate changes? You actually want 2 things. You want resilience. You need to be able to take a blow because stuff happens when the climate changes. Right. And you want propulsion. You want to be moving ahead. You don't want to be hiding under that chair with me saying, James, come out. The climate change is over. Then I said to myself, well, who do I go to for advice on how you get resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? And then I realized I knew this woman. She was 3.8 billion years old. Her name was Mother Nature. And she dealt with more climate changes than anybody. So I called her up, made an appointment, went out to see her. And I said to Mother Nature, how do you build resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? And she said, well, Tom, I have to tell you everything I do unconsciously, but these are my strategies.
Right.
First, she said, I am incredibly adaptive. So in my world, it's not the strongest that survive, not the smartest that survive. It's the most adaptive that survive. And I teach that through a lesson I call natural selection. You may have heard of it. Secondly, she said, I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Wherever I see a blank space in nature, I fill it with a plant or animal perfectly adapted to that niche. I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Third, she said, I'm incredibly pluralistic. Oh, Tom, she said, I'm the most pluralistic person you've ever met. I try 20 different species of everything. I see who wins. And she told me something interesting, James. She told me that she noticed her most diverse ecosystems are her most resilient and propulsive ecosystems. She pointed that out to me. I love pluralism, she said. Fourth, she said, I'm incredibly sustainable. Everything is food. Nothing is wasted. Eat food, poop seed. Eat food, poop seed. Nothing is wasted. Fifth, she said, I'm incredibly hybrid and heterodox in my thinking. No dogmatism for me. I'll try any bees with any flowers, any trees with any soils. I'm incredibly experimental. And six, she said, I'm a lifelong learner. And I take all my learning and turn it into new DNA. And seventh, she said, my healthiest ecosystems all network together to create complex adaptive networks, just like I created complex adaptive coalitions to network together to maximize their resilience and propulsion. And last, she said, Tom, I do believe in the laws of bankruptcy. I kill all my failures. I return them to the great manufacturer in the sky, and I take their energy to nourish my successes. So my argument, when I said to you earlier, James, I'm not on your grid, that's the grid I'm on. Because what I argue is that the political party, the community, the country, the World Affairs Council that most closely mirrors Mother Nature's strategies for building resilience and propulsion when the climate changes, when that is the defining feature of where we are right now in multiple climate changes, is the one that will thrive in the age of acceleration.
So how do you think our political system is doing against that?
Oh, not good, James, not good. You know, I can do this riff now really well, and I can do it really condensed, and that's the product of 5 years of research, what I just distilled for you. And one of the things that you find in this world is that, you know, all the things I got wrong when I was a journalist, James, because I was talking when I should have been listening. And there's so many people on broadcast right now, and so few people just going around do what you do every day and I do every day. I'm just research. I was just in Wilmer, Minnesota, you know. And I don't know what you think about communities, but I know what I think because I went there. You know what I mean? And so many people are running on fumes, it seems to me today. They're political, or that they're extracted from where their team should be.
Right.
I'm not on any team. You may have noticed. I mean, my politics is really unpredictable because I'm actually basing it on my reporting, not on the team. So, you know, so that's a real problem because if you're locked into a framework in the middle of 3 climate changes, the odds of you getting it right across the broad front of policies, I think, is very low.
So that would almost suggest, though, Tom, that maybe we need to find a way to reform our political system in some fashion. You know, one of the things that I think I've mentioned to you, and you and I have been talking about this also, is the fact that, I don't know, even capitalism itself needs some reform in order to serve these complex needs that we now have. Say something about how, you know, what changes and what reforms would you want to see? You know, pick any one. I mean, take the political system.
One that obviously, I think it's investing in the commons and investing in the worker in a very intentional way. So I think over the last 50 years, there were kind of 2 trickle-down theories. One was trickle-down from the right. We cut taxes, and the wealth will trickle down. Everyone will be fine. That didn't really work out. But there was a trickle-down from the center, I would say, a neoliberal trickle-down, which was have open borders, globalization, free trade, and free immigration, and the benefits there will trickle down. And in some cases they did, but they trickled in ways that helped workers in India and China, maybe more than in Michigan and Ohio. And so the lesson I take from all of this, it's another word that I find myself using more often, that is intentional. You got to be very intentional about these things. There's no like simple things. Too many things are connected to too many other things, you know.
Well, and by the way, speak of being intentional. I mean, I think, you know, history can teach us a lesson here, right? Which is if you look at the history of the incentives that we've put in place to make investments in the economy work, that was very intentional. So
Yes.
we encourage companies, as you said, to invest in capital. We allow them to depreciate it, write it off,
Yeah.
because we know that investments in capital are good for the economy. We've done the same thing with things like R&D tax credits, because we know that if an economy invests in R&D, it improves competitiveness. So we allow companies to do, get R&D tax incentive and credits and all
Right.
kinds of things. We have not been as intentional with
Yeah.
regards to the work and the workforce as much.
And that's what I would be. I
We've
would
not,
be. I'd be
right?
running on that, on how do we strengthen the worker, in an age where unions are not going to be there to do that, and so that governments really have to step in, because the political clout and economic clout of unions, for a lot of reasons, globalization, technology, is just not going to be there like it was before.
Right.
Now maybe there are laws that can be passed to make that so, but I think that's a struggle. You know what I mean?
Right.
And at the same time, I think being much more intentional about public investment. And not letting people opt out on, to drive a flight, gated communities,
Right.
private plane, just completely opt out of the economy. And that's what that to me is that these are the debates we should be having. There was, I'm not going to get into politics here, but there was no good time, in my view, for Donald Trump to be president of the United States. But in the middle of 3 climate changes is a very bad time. He doesn't even believe in the first, and I would argue doesn't understand the second 2. And so there's no one navigating. And the reason that's important is when the world is fast, small errors in navigation have huge consequences. It's like the pilot of a 747 just transposing 2 numbers as he enters the navigational data.
Right.
The one is where the 0
Right.
is, and suddenly you're 50,000 miles off course. And the pain of getting back on course could be enormous. And we may be living through that.
Well, we are in the World Affairs Council, so let's take a small, quick detour to another topic we haven't talked about. How does all of this look from the point of view of the rest of the world? Right. In some ways, we've had a very kind of advanced economy, developed economy view in our conversation. So if you're sitting in, Bangladesh, Pakistan, parts of Africa, part of Latin America, how do you think this looks? So that's one of the things, at least, I've found myself thinking about quite a bit, and I think it doesn't often get enough attention. I'd be curious about your view, but at least one view from that angle would be:
Tell me.
on the one hand, this has been in a wonderful time from the point of view of poverty reduction and taking people out of poverty. One of the things I think is quite striking is that if you look at the last 20, 30 years, the sheer number of people who've come out of poverty globally, I think the number is something like 800 million people.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
Yes, yeah.
That's a big deal. So you look at it from that point of view and you say, good positive direction and momentum. And you might even say the same thing with, for example, things like standards of living and health, access to technology, and all of that. But I think one of the things I worry about now, from the point of view of the developing countries, is they're also going to get hit by some of these climate changes we're talking about. One of those is the fact that I think it used to be the case that if you're a poor developing country, the pathway was you go from being an agrarian economy, you industrialize, and you become a source of cheap labor for the rest of the world.
Yes.
And that's kind of how you get on the way, and eventually off and on you go. That path is not as assured as it used to be. Technology is one of the reasons, right? So if you can do 3D printing, you talk about 3D printing, you can use AI and technology and so forth. You may not need cheap labor as much as you used to need. In fact, it's actually one of my good friends is the economist Danny Roderick, who pays a lot of attention to developing countries. And one of the things that he's coined a term for this, which is called kind of premature deindustrialization, where that pathway may not longer be as available.
Yes.
And so you start to think, and then there's some countries that have done okay because they happen to fall into the value chain or ecosystem of a US or a China, and that's probably fine. So think of Vietnam and so forth. But you've got countries that are not part of that. So I think there's a question now about how do we think about what it looks like for those countries?
So the way I think about it is that at the broadest trend, James, what we're living through, I believe, is that average is over. Right. So average is over for every worker, average is over every country, average is over for every company, and average is over for the climate too. And for those of us who grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this kind of golden era where my uncle in Minneapolis was the loan officer in 1962 for the Farmers and Mechanics Bank, and he only had a high school degree. Is there a loan officer at any bank in America, in the world today, who only has a high school degree? So my uncle had something called a high-wage, middle-skilled job.
Yep.
He was middle-skilled and he had a high wage. And in a world of protected walls, slower American dominance, you could have that. Okay. So average is also over for every country. And what I mean by that is that in the 50 years after World War II were not only great for average workers, they were great for average countries. Oh, if you were an average country, that was your era. Why? First of all, there were two superpowers competing for your affection, throwing foreign aid at you, throwing military equipment at you, building your government house, educating your kids at Patrice Lumumba University of Moscow or San Francisco State here.
Right.
You could be Syria and lose count them, 3 wars to Israel and get your army rebuilt for free all 3 times. Okay?
Right.
That was fantastic. Secondly, climate change was very moderate. Populations were under control.
Right.
No one had a cell phone to see what Paris looked like, or Phoenix, or actually the leader in the valley next door. And China was not in the World Trade Organization. So everybody could be in the low-wage textile business.
Absolutely. Right.
I would argue all that flips in the 20th century. Now, no superpower wants to touch you because all they win is a bill. And there's no Cold War, so they couldn't care less. Populations are now out of control. Nigeria will have more people than America by 2050. 400 million, we'll have about 380 million. And all these countries, population has exploded. Climate change is now hammering them. You know, Senegal's already at 2 degrees rise average temperature since the Industrial Revolution. 2 degrees rise average temperature. Where did I hear that number? Oh, that's what the Paris Climate Agreement is designed to prevent by 2100.
Good. Right.
So Senegal's already there. They're actually going to 4 degrees.
Right.
And China's in the World Trade Organization, so nobody can be in the textile business. That's your, the early deindustrialization. And so what that is doing is that it's stressing out these countries and fracturing some of them, and they're now hemorrhaging their people. And so that's why we have more people on the move, political refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and climate migrants since World War II. And our hemisphere, it's from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. By the way, 3 of the most deforested, climate-battered countries in our hemisphere. Across the ocean, it's from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. And what the biggest thing happening in the world is these countries are hemorrhaging their people, and they're trying to escape the world of disorder into the world of order, changing the politics of the world of order, creating these populist nationalist backlashes all across the world of disorder. So I believe the central geopolitical challenge of our time, the issue that the World Affairs Council here is going to have to study, Jane's successor, I believe is how we manage to stabilize this world of disorder. Because, see, we're in a moment we've never seen before. The world used to be governed by empires. Then we broke up into all these nation states.
Right.
But what we've never lived in a world is where nation states are collapsing in a post-imperial world. And so there's no natural body to come in and order Syria today or order Libya today. And so you're getting very new governance models. You know, Libya is a country with only 3 institutions. It's got an oil company, it's got a central bank that distributes the wealth of the oil company, and it's got a Coast Guard. Well, how's that? Why does it have a Coast Guard? Because Italy created the Libyan Coast Guard, literally, boats, training captains, in order to keep refugees from spilling out of Libya to Italy. And so Libya is now beginning to work actually in municipalities inside, Italy's beginning to work in municipalities inside Libya to try to stabilize their governance. And that's why, again, if I were advising a presidential candidate, if I were running, Trump wants to create a 5th force, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, which is just the dumbest idea, possible. I'd create a 5th force, the Peace Corps. I think reviving the Peace Corps to go work in the countries of disorder, in communities, what Italy's doing inside Libya is going to be more important than ever. One thing I certainly wouldn't be doing is taking away aid from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to punish them for their people trying to escape the horrors of what they're living in, which is literally the stupidest thing of all the things Trump is doing. It's literally, it's so breathtakingly stupid, you just, you don't even know where to begin,
So Tom, we're in Silicon Valley. One of the climate changes you've talked about, is the role and power of technology. And often when we have these conversations, we talk about it in terms of its impact on the economy, on innovation, growth, productivity, which are all wonderful, even questions about labor force and so forth. But link the role of technology to these geopolitical forces you've been talking about. How do you see that?
Well, I think the best way to answer that question, James, talk about a column I did a few weeks ago. It was an interview with David Coleman and Stephanie Sanford, who run the College Board. People who do the PSAT and SAT exams. And they've been studying this issue, and they've been thinking, what is it every high school, there are many things a high school graduate should know, but they decided actually there are two things every high school graduate should know. Two codes: how to code a computer and the code of the U.S. Constitution. And I think those things really go together. And we're living in a world right now, I'm not going to name names, but I can think of a few well-known technologists in Silicon Valley, Facebook, who took the first course and never took the second. And we are living with the result of that. So they've taken their coding deep into us without any of the constitutional coding that should go with it. And that mismatch is a huge problem, I think, for our society. And I think these companies are getting very close to being seen as enemies. Enemies of the people, and enemies of progress, and enemies of stable societies. Right. And they're real close. One more, Cambridge Analytics, and I think they're going to have real problems. I work for something that's printed on a dead tree, called a newspaper. And on this newspaper, we had certain rules. The first rule was that if James Manyika wants to run an ad on my newspaper, he has to identify who he is and the source of his income, where the money's coming from. And on the other side, it said to me, if I misspelled James' name, we had an editor who said you have to correct James's name. You misspelled it on the dead tree. Then on the dead tree, we have people who are called readers and people who are called advertisers. Then along came Facebook, and they said, no. We are not a dead tree. We are something totally different. We are a platform. So we don't need any of your regulators, and we don't need any of your editors, but we want all of your readers and all of your advertisers. And we didn't know what to do. And by the way, they were cool, and we were not. They wanted to go fast and break things, and we just wanted to print all the news, fit to print without fear or favor. And so we didn't know what to do, but they said they had the answer. Trust us. Trust us, they said. And we trusted them. And they violated our trust. And we're living with the implications of that.
So if you take all these questions about, rebuilding trust, reviving communities, I'm just curious, as we come to kind of the end of our time, Tom, if you were trying to put up an agenda for 2020, regardless of, who the candidate is or any part or whatever the case may be, what do you think should be on that 2020 agenda?
Well, I just think the centerpiece of the 2020 agenda is we have many big, hard things to do, James, and big, hard things can only be done together. And I do believe that there is still a longing in this country for someone to pull us together. The problem is we now have social networks that are designed to get you addicted to enragement and quick reaction. That is their nicotine. And we have networks in this country who are designed, whose business model is to make you angry and stupid. And so we have we have much work to do to overcome these technological challenges we face today. But somehow, and this is why I'm not endorsing anybody, but I think it's interesting to note how good a reception Biden got for his initial announcement ad, which was all built on, his critics said, nostalgia. He wanted to harken back to the Declaration of Independence and in effect, who we were on our best days. I think that was actually the right place to start. I think there's a deep longing in the country for someone who can bring us together again. And that's why we have this anomaly of we have the most soaring stock market, we have the greatest economy in the history of the Milky Way galaxy, according to our president, okay? And yet he can't get his popularity, out of the low 40s or high 30s. What's that about? Well, there's got to be a reason for that. And I think one of the reasons is that the fact that we have a president who does not want to be president of the whole country. He wants to be president of his base, and people intuit that's a bad thing. And we cannot do big, hard things anymore, because big, hard things can only be done together. I think that's got to be the beginning,
Right.
And I don't know how you do that.
I still want to press you, though, on, so what would be on your agenda where you'd say, we've got to be debating these issues.
Yes.
We've got to be solving these issues. What would be on that list?
Push authority down to the highest trust level, to the community and state level as much as we can.
Right.
Change our tax laws to incentivize companies to go back into the education business and to invest in workers, and then rebuild the commons. Be investing in the public investments that create wealth for people, even if their incomes aren't necessarily going up, that create the public schools, the public spaces, and the public transport that give people a sense of wealth, even if they don't have it in the pocketbook necessarily. Right. Those would be 3 of my priorities.
That's a good place to stop.
I think so.
I think we're over time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thank you.